Welcome to the Gallery of Wicked Provocations. I am one of your co-curators for this gallery event. I am Terry Shoemaker. I'm a lecturer at Arizona State University and am finishing up my first year on the board for the Society for Values in Higher Education. And my co-curator this morning is Assistant Professor Melanie Howard, who is working at Fresno Pacific University, and wanted to take just a moment and say thanks to all of our panelists and thanks to everyone who is tuning in. We do have a Q&A option at the bottom, and we would appreciate all of our participants using that option. Melanie and I will be watching that screen and trying to incorporate those questions after each of the teams are presenting. We will have a moment of question and response time. And I want to take just a quick moment before I turn it over to Melly and just explain kind of the background of the Gallery of Wicked Provocations. The idea arose as we were thinking about what a virtual kind of presentation style might look like and how broad we could make this. And then one of the other things that was really important as we were thinking about this, so much of what we do and so much of our thinking, at least is in the way that I understand it, are based on some, I guess, foundational assumptions, which oftentimes means we're starting kind of from a very comfortable, known position. But the idea with the Wicked Provocations was, what if we actually started with kind of the unknown, uncomfortable position, started there with a team of interdisciplinary scholars and let them question, let them provoke each other and see where that takes them. They can back off of that. They can even go maybe more uncomfortable with that idea. But then these teams have the opportunity then to present their provocation and just where the team went. In their thinking. And what we wanted to do this year was to open it up broadly to any types of presentations, whether these were artistic, whether these were more of a standard type presentation of describing what's going on. And so we are excited for the first Gallery of Wicked Provocations, and I am going to turn it over to Melanie Howard to introduce our first team of scholars.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Terry. And thanks to all of our attenders who are here today. And thanks to all of our presenters. We are looking forward to being wickedly provoked. Our first two Wicked Provocations, in some ways, Terry and I put back to back because we were hoping that they would be provocative of each other. Both of these provocations are dealing with issues of digital education. And so our pattern for today is we'll have about 10 minutes for each team to present, followed by about 4 or 5 minutes of conversation. But we are also going to have a slightly longer conversation time after our first two provocations, because we imagine that the two of these are going to be able to provoke each other in exciting ways. So with no further ado, let me introduce our first team of Wicked Provocateurs, led by Stephen Baker. Our other team members include Jessica Camarada, Eric Eklund, Irene Wolf, and this team will be presenting on the digital divide and other cautionary tales from higher education in the time of COVID. So Stephen and team, we turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Melly. Let me just share my screen, get going. Because we are a bunch of academics, so of course we went for a PowerPoint presentation and a paper here. Okay, so this is the team. I am Stephen Baker. I'm an associate professor of psychology in the School of Health Sciences and Education. Along with me is Dr. Jessica Camarada, who is a PT, who's also in the School of Health Sciences and Education. Jess is also the director of our general education program. We have Eric Eklund, Dr. Eric Eklund, associate professor of management over in the Shields School of Business, and Dr. Irene Wolf, who is associate professor of biology and the director of the honors program. When we were at, and I believe it was Eric, Jessica, and I were at SVHE, and Ryan threw out that question of So you have no limitations. All the resources are at your hand. How would you redesign public education, or what would public higher education look like? It got me thinking as to, well, how would we answer that as a private liberal arts school? So after SVHE, I came on back and I threw that question out to Eric, Jessica, and we dragged Irene into this. And over the year, we've been talking about this. We've had some ideas about a research project, was going to present this, and then COVID happened. This call came out, and once again, I pulled everyone together and said, hey, here's an opportunity for us to continue and expand. I'm here. Okay, so quick snapshot of St. Francis University. We are a private Catholic institution. We are in the liberal arts tradition. We claim to be the oldest Franciscan university in America. There's another Franciscan university out there that disputes us, but hey, we're going with it. Founded in 1858. Our student population is just over 2,000, primarily undergraduates. We have an incredible retention rate of 80%. And I think that is important to understand, because what the administration, what our Office of Retention did, was really sell this issue to the faculty. So retention isn't in an administrative office, it is shared across the university. We are a Division I NCAA school. We have 23 women's and men's sports. Once again, that is important because as you look on the right side of the slide, we are located in Loretto, Pennsylvania, with a whopping population of 1,302. That does not include students. We're situated northwest part of the state, so it's circled down there. We're closer to Pittsburgh, and we are rural. If you know Penn State, that I took that tagline from them. But the Division I sports adds to our diversity. It brings students in here. And that's important because that also creates a challenge for us. Because the majority of our students are student athletes, that also creates challenges for academics around time management, sports schedules, scholarships, abilities. So what we did, and this is part of our paper that we pulled together, is we each reflected back on spring 2020 and what happened, how it affected us. And then what I did with this slide is I kind of distilled our thoughts looking for common themes. I wish my bullet points came out better. Those are little COVID, whatever they're called. Irene will yell at me because I don't know it. But anyways, little COVID things. One of the things that came out is, so we were thrown, like many other institutions of higher education, we were thrown into remote learning. And for some classes, this worked, but particularly for the science classes, and then for our health sciences. Health sciences are a big part of our school. The virtual labs just weren't satisfactory. Okay, that there needs to be this trial and error. There needs to be kind of getting your hands dirty, wet, messy, looking at your mistakes, trying to figure out why those mistakes happen, how do you correct them, you know, what do you learn from them. At a practical level, this is also true for our clinical labs. You know, to be able to have that patient connection that just didn't happen when you make this virtual. One of the themes that came across all of us was there is this need for engagement. Engagement with faculty, engagement with students, and actually our Student Government Association undertook a survey of the students in the spring. And one of the things that they came strongly back with is they were incredibly appreciative of what we as faculty did, how quickly we responded to get online, how attentive we were to them, but they did not like online education. They wanted face-to-face. They wanted that engagement. They wanted to have that connection. And I think that that goes to this sense of vested interest. This is a process. This isn't a product. Jessica brought out the notion of that while many of us went and made our classes asynchronous because we believed that this would be beneficial, most of our students during the summer would take maybe 1 or 2 at the most online courses. Suddenly they were taking 5 and 6 online courses. So making a course asynchronous, we thought would ease the burden on them. Her PT student said, no, it didn't. We want synchronous. And part of that goes to this sense of they are a cohort, that this is a learning community. And I think that this expands beyond the health science programs. We really vest our interest in creating a learning community across all of our disciplines. There was this desire from our students about a professor's presence. And Eric brought this one up, that, that presence isn't necessarily this, isn't necessarily being live and hearing me, but being attentive to our students and responding to them, knowing that we are there, we haven't abandoned you, we might be remote like we're doing now, but there is this connection. That creates the real problem of the digital divide. Reliable connectivity, differences in time zones, understanding the intricacies of online education, which the keynote speaker on Monday really pointed out, some of the assumptions that we make. There is the concern that students can be silent, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not learning. By going asynchronous, the positive is that it provides control for the student. It allows them to maintain some time management skills. So from there, we started to look at this fall and what our fall would look like. We have made a commitment, our administration has made the commitment that we are going to be face-to-face. We are a residential university. Our students have been very clear that they want it to be face-to-face. They want to be here. But we need to protect our students. We need to protect our faculty and staff. And that creates a little bit of a tension. And that goes to the reality of it. As a residential, we're bringing in lots of money from room and board. If our students aren't here, what does that do for our bottom line? There was the question of, well, wait a moment, I'm paying a flat tuition, but if I go over to our online, if the student goes over to our online courses, that tuition's a lot less than our flat tuition. What does this do for athletics? And not so much that they're not going to be able to participate and we might lose some revenue there, but once again, they are a cohort. There's a team atmosphere there that gets lost when the athletics are not part of it. And that, as we all know, this can change in a moment. I mean, nobody really knows what's going to happen tomorrow. So there's lots of anxiety from the student's perspective, anxiety from the faculty's perspective, and administration as to how do we plan this.
You've got about 1 minute left, Stephen.
Okay, if we look in the future, I think Eric grabbed this perfectly, and this is over on the right side of the slide. It seems likely that the future will be brightest for those institutions best able to adapt quickly and effectively to these uncertain times. Flexibility, adaptability, okay? And that we need to look at online education, embrace it, but also understand kind of the one size doesn't fit all. How do we address this? And the last slide, questions, comments, or feedback. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Stephen. Thanks so much to your team that has been working at this. We have had a number of questions coming in. We have about 3 minutes or so here. So maybe I'll pick up on what I think is sort of a cloud of questions that Gustavo Rincon is asking about this balance between economics on the one hand and the lives of our professors and students on the other. How do we think about that balance? What are the ethical ways of approaching that, even as I think pretty much all of us are employed by these universities?
The simple answer is we don't know what the solution is to balance that. We recognize our university cannot survive without the revenue represented by room and board. We recognize also, and we all value very much the face-to-face experience. And we think it's an important reason why people choose our institution. They do have other choices if they wish to go online. And we all are very eager, I think, to get back into the classroom. But we are concerned about the cost to people's lives and health that might be represented by returning to campus. And we're not entirely confident that we have a system in place to protect that. So this is a question we're still struggling with, and we're still not entirely sure what our semester is going to look like. We're supposed to find out next week.
We'll say, as a teacher in the health sciences, you know, we do have permission no matter what level the state is. Our state's going on a red, yellow, green system. Even if we're in red, we have permission to teach the health science students because you can't teach them everything virtually. And so we would be teaching, you know, with every precaution available to us. And I would be doing that in a hybrid model where I'm doing everything I can online, you know, everything possible, and then getting them into the lab for those things that you just can't do online. I don't want to do that, but there's really no way around it other than completely pause these students' health science education. I don't know what the right answer is, but you're not graduating health science professionals for, you know, an extended period of time if you don't do it that way. So.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we have limited time right now. Again, though, after our second provocation, we'll have a little bit more extended opportunity for discussion of our first two provocations. So for now, let me turn things over to Dr. Shoemaker to introduce our second provocation. And in the meantime, Dr. Bain Salvo will be bringing up our panelists for the second presentation.
So as Eric Bain Salvo is promoting and demoting people at this moment, let me remind all of our participants and our attendees of this webinar session that there is a Q&A function here in Zoom at the bottom of your screen, and feel free to jump in and add your questions. So the first group wanted to offer a cautionary provocation as it comes to the digital world in pedagogy in the fall. Our next group kind of takes a little bit of a different angle to this, and the second provocation is opportunities for teaching, learning, and storytelling through digital technologies. And I'm going to turn it over to that group, and whoever is the spokesperson, if you would introduce those members who are available to start, we would greatly appreciate it.
So Paul Cook is our spokesperson. I'm waiting for him to come up.
Panelist.
Okay. Can you guys hear me now?
Paul, we can hear you, but there is a massive echo right now coming from your audio.
Okay.
So that's
I think I figured out the problem.
I think you're in there.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes, much better.
Okay, good. Well, I apologize in part as well because I'm having some audio issues. So as long as you guys can hear me, I'm going to go ahead and continue. But unfortunately, I can't hear anything from you all. And that's why I actually had my phone out, because I was doing this on my computer and on my phone, so I could hear on my phone, but I can't hear on my computer. So without any further ado, though, let me go ahead and introduce our group. My name is Paul Cook, and I'm at IU Kokomo. I'm an associate professor of English, and I'm going to introduce our panel. First up is Paul Swift, who's a former board member of SVHE. We also have, I guess I could share my video, couldn't I? Hi. We also have Dr. Christina Romero Ivanova. She's an assistant professor of education at IU Kokomo. We have Maria Tobar, who's an online instructional designer for Indiana University. And then the person with the longest title of all is Julie Sam. She's a professor of education. She's also an associate VCAA at IU Kokomo, and she's also the director of our Center for Teaching, Learning, and Assessment. So our provocation is actually so provocative that our group couldn't even agree on what the provocation would be. And so that's how provocative it is. So without any further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and break it out. Our provocation is that online education is better than traditional face-to-face teaching. And we're going to show you why and how. And again, not all the panelists even agree with that, but that's what makes it a great provocation, right? And so COVID-19 kind of thrust us all into this space where, regardless of technical proficiency or comfort level, we had to be online. And so you had folks, you had side by side, right? Folks who were really into digital literacy and creating cool stuff online and immersive experiences, doing this alongside folks who just a few years ago were complaining because they couldn't show VHS tapes in their classrooms anymore, right? So two ends of the spectrum here, and you know who you are, right? I mean, you know who these folks are. They are out there, and we love them, but it's a spectrum, right? So all these folks, right, got tossed into this into this online space and found themselves having to do this kind of work. And so we believe that what this shift has really brought to our attention is that not everyone is on board with online learning. And so kind of a follow-up to our provocation that online learning is better, period. No qualifications, is this question: what is it that you're trying to accomplish in a face-to-face class that you can't do in a well-designed, immersive online experience? Like, what are you trying to do in the online space, right? Like, I can put on a good show in a classroom just like anybody else, but is that necessarily teaching? And is that necessarily learning? And with that, I'm going to turn things over to my panelists. Thank you.
I'm going to first talk about how online learning, it gives students a voice that they didn't otherwise have. So moving to online removes uncertainty and prejudice and provides anonymity, giving a platform and voice for groups such as women in science, people of color, students with cognitive disabilities, and provides equal opportunities to engage discussions and chats. When we moved online in the spring, I had lots of conversations with faculty. I have a few that I want to highlight today that just gives us examples of that. So Sarah Heath is a history professor at IU Kokomo. She described that she had a quiet student that was doing poorly in her class, and once they went remote, the student messaged her and asked questions. Sarah then saw her grades improving once she had a voice to ask for help. Heather Kennedy Eden is a professor in our hospitality and tourism program, and she explained that she purposely introduced Flipgrid so that she could keep more contact with her students when they went remote. She found that this tool, she was able to hear from everyone, especially those that were usually quiet. And then finally, Kristen Snoddy, she's a senior lecturer in English, had a talker in class. I know you've had those before. She tried to talk to her about letting others speak, but nothing worked. But when she moved her class synchronously to Zoom, she was able to mute all microphones and set up incentives for students to contribute, while her talker followed those guidelines and provided opportunities to let others have a voice.
So I am going to start, or I'm going to discuss how online spaces are more user-friendly and visually and aesthetically appealing than ever before. As Paul mentioned, I am an online instructional designer at IU, and I work primarily with faculty members who have little knowledge and or desire for teaching online. Well, COVID caused the modality of teaching to 100% online format. And as we all know, the stressors and anxiety level of faculty members drastically increased. This led to faculty members, stating that they would just simply like to copy and paste their content into Canvas. Canvas is the LMS system that we use at IU. So I find myself being the bearer of bad news and advising that this would be a disservice to all students. Additionally, the course material has to be accessible and mode appropriate due to the population of students that we were serving at that time, which is the entire university. So for this presentation or webinar, I wanted to focus on a couple of things. One would be the layout of the actual assessments. So I'm not sure if you guys heard of the TILT format, but it is a transparency in learning and teaching format. It's composed of 3 elements: the purpose, task, and criteria. And that's what I use to format or framework the actual assessments in the course, whether it's an assignment, a quiz, an exam, whatever the students had to do in terms of an assignment or assessment, we use that actual format. And then lastly, courses must be user-friendly. So going back to being afraid to not only teach an online course, but also take an online course, or take a course online, and having the ability to use videos and graphics to make the course navigation of an actual LMS system more approachable and of an art for students and faculty members. So while many may feel opposed, and it's something we experience still to this day, of teaching online or taking an online course, the advantage that we have now than we had before is a level of technology resources that we have that allows us to provide a platform of creating a visually compelling, aesthetically and appealing, accessible course. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. R.I. in her part of the presentation.
Yeah. So I think the question is, how is online education and online teaching and learning effective? What are some areas of comfort levels? What does it provide as far as student comfort? And when you think about different online technologies and technology in itself, how can technologies be used to privilege a space for students' voices and their comfort levels? And we come to digital storytelling, which is my area of work. Digital storytelling is essentially storytelling using images, pacing, a dramatic question of some kind, a soundtrack of music, gift of the voice, or texting, which I let my students use if they prefer to text their story rather than to voice it. Point of view, what kind of content, the amount of content within the story. And it's all using all of these elements that come together to construct the story, but digitally, either through iMovie or PowerPoint or some kind of multimodal venue for telling, in my students' experience, a crucial life event, something that's highly impactful, right? So technology can actually be a tool, can actually provide a space for having those students to share their lives, not only to share content, but to share parts of their experiences and where they come from, something we call habitus, their behaviors, right? So in my classes, we do digital storytelling and we talk about our lives, but we also include some kind of rigorous activities. So can online technology be just as rigorous as face-to-face? And the answer is yes, it can be just as rigorous. Students in my classes not only tell their digital storytelling modes, they present these to their fellow cohort, to their peers, to myself, but they also peer review. So we're looking at analyzing, we're looking at critical thinking, and we're looking at this rigorous kind of activity that involves technology, habitus, learning, but also privileging students' voices in the classroom. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Paul Swift.
Hi, everyone. It's a little dark in here. Let me turn on some light. Sorry. I got bounced out of our session. Hi. So my contribution to our session has to deal with defending the idea that there are some things that can be done much better online than they can be done in the traditional classroom. So often it's the case that students never ask questions, and in discussion-based classes, that's something that's very important. So questions are a vehicle for learning in discussion-based classes, yet often it's difficult to get anyone to ask any questions. questions. And that happens for multiple reasons, but some of them can be eliminated by using online synchronous learning. So some students lack courage to speak up and will never ask questions, and some others will overcome their reluctance to ask questions, but wind up asking only bad questions. So how do we get students to ask good questions? That's the theme of my contribution to the Provocation session. And the title of my original presentation is When the Questions Are the Answers, Advantages of Synchronous Online Learning and Teaching. So, or for teachers who say they don't give an F. So this is about giving an F. And so I devised a strategy after COVID-19 called Everyone Gets an F Day. Sometimes we give students an A at the beginning of the semester, but I had students seeming to as if they were disengaged because they were online. So I devised this short activity, which I think can be used to do a better job than anyone could do in face-to-face learning. And that's supposed to be the provocative element. So here's how it works. You announce to the class, everyone will get an F who doesn't ask a question today. You may ask a live question or write one in our shared online text box. This is a way to motivate students. So most will post something, and you say, fill this chat box up. The first time I did this in about 20 minutes, I had 26 questions posted. This technique of idea or question generation, which aims at quantity, is sometimes called brainstorming. So among the questions asked, most of them were not really good, but 3 out of 26 questions submitted to the live chat box were very good. So an instructor can then the instructor can scan through the questions and thank each student for their effort. However, by responding only to the good questions, a professor can offer a model for what a good question actually is for students. Thus, the activity gives a model of how to ask good questions and shows students what excellent questioning can be. Most students today have grown up being comfortable with texting, so the online chat feature can be a comfortable interface used to reach out to some students who have trouble forming questions orally. The live chat feature is especially useful for shy or quiet students, as well as for students who may stutter or have a speech impediment or may be working in a second or third language. This technological advantage can create a more inclusive classroom by getting these students actively involved. So the online chat feature offers something which cannot be replicated in the traditional face-to-face class. Why? Well, attempts at brainstorming are too time-consuming in a traditional face-to-face class, but the shared group text feature enables a teacher to collect many ideas and questions in a very short period of time. So sometimes when students ask questions in the traditional classroom, time is squandered while the student stammers out a poor question. So how can we encourage questioning but avoid wasting valuable time? The live chat feature helps, since a professor may simply ignore the poor questions and not respond to them. So to sum up, when used optimally, this online chat features can help students engage and participate in class discussions better than the traditional face-to-face teaching learning experience. This technique provides a comfortable place for students to ask questions. Sometimes students don't like the sound of their own voice. Sometimes they think they are rude if they talk too much. And sometimes they're just too shy. There are many reasons why students have difficulties asking questions, but one way to get them to ask questions is to threaten them with everyone gets an F day. So that's my presentation in contribution to our Provocations session.
Thanks, Paul. Let me just remind the team here, you have about 1 minute left, and then we're going to bring in the other panelists for a conversation.
Cool. So we don't need we will yield back our minute then, I think, because we're ready to engage in more provocations.
Perfect. While Eric Bain Salvo is adding in the previous panelist, let me throw out a question to this group. And I like the constitution of this group of professors and online designers. I think this was a great provocation. And with the provocation that it's better, have you all from this second group encountered, though, any particular issues that need addressing, that would improve it, but we're simply not there yet with the online technology.
One of the things that is being carted out now is lockdown browsers, attempts to stop students from cheating online, which there are already at least 5 different ways to get around this post on Google. So there are some things like you still need monitored if you have exam format kinds of things. That's something that I know technologically people are, different companies are trying to, the lockdown browser, but the fact is whenever there are mechanisms to prevent cheating, students will immediately try to find ways around them and usually find ways around them. So that's something, but I don't know that that specifically intersects with our diverse collection of issues here.
No, I think Paul's right. I think technologically, now I'm a writing teacher, so I don't give any tests or exams, but I know my colleagues in the sciences do give a lot of high stakes testing. And I know the technology has not yet caught up in terms of being able to track students and surveil them basically to keep them from cheating. My response to that would actually be less on the technological focus and more on the focus of what we mean by learning and teaching. So there seems to be this notion of a lot of people that just the transition to online basically means taking content and putting it into modules, and that's learning. And that I would add, I mean, that getting over that assumption is part of what's holding us back, is that there's this notion that a lot of people have that online teaching just means taking scads of content and putting it into modules. And that's not what it is. That's not teaching. That's taking lots of content and putting it into modules.
It's funny, and it's not really funny, but as administration seems to be making a push to send that same sort of message, that's not sufficient. I'm facing 8 trainings that I have to finish before the end of September that are exactly that.
But when has administration really cared about teaching, Eric?
Oh, and that's a separate provocation, perhaps. But I was struck as I was going through these trainings today that this is exactly the type of stuff that my administration likes to tell me isn't sufficient for my online courses.
Yep. You just need to get rid of all administrators. Waiting for Eric to pop back in there.
You're just trying to free up a position for yourself.
Someone in the comments made that same claim, Stephen.
I agree with Paul in that, and I would extend it. It's not only changing. You said people's perception, and I kept translating that to faculty, but it's also students. I don't know if students know what online education is necessarily or what to expect. But you're right. I mean, Irene and I were talking previously, and I was talking about how I teach an online developmental course and a face-to-face course. And while it's the same content, there's one activity that I do face-to-face that I have not figured out how to bring online yet. And I really, in developing it, I really needed to see these as 2 separate courses that I simply couldn't take my face-to-face and plop it over here. That it needed a different vehicle to get to that point.
All right, so in order to wrap up this conversation, I'm going to let Eric Bain Salvo, I think he came on and raised his hand. I'm going to let him ask a question, but he only has 10 seconds to ask his question. And then I'm going to ask some of our female panelists to respond to Eric's question, if they will, please.
I didn't have a question.
Oh, I thought you came in. I apologize. So let me ask a question just very quickly from the women on the panel. One of the critiques that I was hearing from the first panel was, if I'm correct, is that online doesn't produce the same type of community that in-person does. It doesn't like cultivate that richness of it. How would you respond to that provocation? Christina, I see your hand there.
I'm waiting, I'm ready. Okay, so I offered a citation of our manuscripts. I was first author on that's coming out in September that actually centers on this aspect, because I have also 3 students who wrote with me on that article, and talking about the very nature of online and how it was a very seamless kind of transition from face-to-face. Online for them in this particular freshman learning community class was the same. But I want to say it's not just because of the technology, it is other practices also that you have to do, obviously. You know, you're going to have to, as an instructor, you're going to have to keep in touch with students. You're going to have to check in with them. You're going to have to be available and be flexible. And so I want to say it's kind of like a melding of those different things. But in my experience, and my students in this article, they write about it, that the technology pieces, like using Flipgrid, using Google Docs to create news stories, using Zoom and Zoom breakout rooms, are actually fundamentally like very helpful to that transition. Had we not used Zoom, had we not had class online, it would have been, they actually were eager and couldn't wait to get to class because they were so isolated.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I hate to end this conversation here because I think this is such a fruitful conversation right now as we all think about fall semesters. But we do have 3 other provocations to get to. And so I'm going to turn it over to Professor Howard.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Yes, wonderful conversation. Thank you so much to our first 2 teams. In many ways, our 3rd provocation, I think, is going to be an interesting conversation partner to what we've already heard. The topic for our 3rd provocation is emergency management in academia, converting internships into academic capstone courses mid-semester, and additional future considerations. So I have the feeling that this will tie into some of what we've already been thinking about so far today. The panelists for our next provocation are Bo Shine, Kelly Brown, Sarah Heath, and Eric Bain Salvo. So thanks so much for being with us today, and we'll turn it over to your team.
Well, thank you. My name is Bo Shine. I'm an assistant professor in criminal justice and homeland security at IU Kokomo, and am working with 3 of my colleagues on this presentation. I think we've got a great team because we've got a good group of perspectives and interests represented. So our other teammates include Dr. Sarah Heath, who's an associate professor and chair of history, political science, and philosophy. We've got Dr. Kelly Brown, who's chair of my department, Criminal Justice and Homeland Security, and also associate professor. And then we've got Dr. Eric Bain Salvo, who's professor of philosophy and religious studies, along with being dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. Without further ado, I'm going to hand off to Dr. Heath, who's going to tackle the first part of our presentation, and then I will cover the second half, and Dr. Brown and Dr. Bain Salvo will assist us in answering questions. Sarah, I think you're muted there.
Sorry, there we go. I was popped out and popped right back in. Okay, thanks. So we were starting with this idea about sort of, you know, the new demands that are placed on people, and we certainly share the anxieties of people who really need direct practical experiences. And so we're thinking a lot about, you know, what are ways that you may be able to help with this transition to online learning. So in this area, really what we're thinking about is internships. And so we recognize that in a lot of fields, internships are the first practical exposure that our students get, applying skills professionally. This may be a springboard to their eventual career. And for many others, this is a way that students can identify and develop skills that they've been working on, right? So what do I need to do by the time I graduate? I should acknowledge as well that we believe internships are a key component in many of our majors, because they encourage students to think about ways that the stated disciplinary outcomes will actually be engaged. So in the 2 fields, Bo Shine and I, Bo in criminal justice, we have learning outcomes that urge students to analyze and apply theories of crime causation, to demonstrate an understanding of problems and issues facing contemporary criminal justice and possible solutions to the problem. Identifying issues of diversity and potential solutions to discrimination across all areas of criminal justice, right? Even in history, you know, I'm an associate professor of history. we have an internship in our field, and exposing students to diverse viewpoints, using experience with internships and presentations and the like to really demonstrate their own command of the skills that they may bring to community settings after they graduate. And I'll be happy to talk more about how you do an internship in history if that's helpful. So obviously, I mean, we know that there are a lot of, very basic practical considerations, right? Students need to engage in high impact practices, and active learning is one of those ways of doing that. This is the chance to apply the quote unquote book learning and to think about, again, that viable option for them after they graduate. Now, under ideal circumstances, internships involve a number of important considerations for any faculty member who oversees those. So you might think about things like placement, right? I might want to help a student who wants to work in a particular arena that's related to my major. So I have to think about what are the opportunities to engage not only the curriculum, but to give them a leg up on that future profession. Oversight, we work with site supervisors, and so internships have to be overseen by us in terms of academic issues, by a site supervisor who really regulates the person's activities at whatever location they're placed at. And then, of course, the biggie, thinking about university policies, but integrating those with the rules or regulations that exist at many sites. And those are not always uniform. So, for example, at the university, students, of course, have a variety of behavioral codes of conduct, but especially in criminal justice and education, a background check is necessary. And so you have to adhere to regulations. And so for us as the supervisors of internships, you have to think about the ways in which we might integrate or have to discuss further, making sure that the student is aware of those policies and why they're important. Now, obviously that lent us to, that big impact when the COVID pandemic hit, right? There are practical considerations like, how do we go about regulating the conditions in which a student works? Can we require that a student sterilize a workspace? Can we even do placements, right? Many sites have closed temporarily, and so it may not be as easy for us to find a location in which students can carry out an internship. And this also raises a number of ethical concerns, right? That we know that some of our students are getting closer to graduation, and many people who are younger say, well, that tends to affect older people, and I know I'm gonna be just fine, right? And so we really have to worry about the ethics behind, placing people and encouraging them to be safe even while they're developing or refining the skills that they obtain. And finally, of course, the pandemic may affect people with different income levels, right? That the COVID pandemic has limited family incomes, and in some cases, that adds a sense of urgency for students who want to complete an internship, but who maybe have lost access to a car, or perhaps they don't have suitable access to the internet. So if they have the option of using electronic communication, that may be reduced or made much more challenging. And so in all of these cases, we recognized that the arrival of the pandemic really shifted gears for us in terms of how those internships could be carried out. And on to Bo. And Bo, you're muted as well.
Thank you. So to pick up where Sarah left off there in terms of how do we address these, what are some solutions to some of the issues? And we broke them down from sort of practical, ethical, and student learning perspectives. So from a practical standpoint, we had immediate mid-semester solutions that we needed to create for students whose internships were suspended indefinitely or canceled. And so how do you go about doing that? What does that look like? Well, first there needs to be assignments created to make up for the hours lost from the internships. And so you know, obviously different campuses, different universities have different requirements for their internships. We typically tie 40 hours internship hours to each credit. So a 3 credit hour internship would be 120 hours in addition to the academic components of the course, which they were still able to complete online. But what type of assignments, you know, what do those look like? I can speak sort of anecdotally as our internship coordinator. One of the things that I did to replace that was to create position papers, weekly 2-page position papers that, you know, excluding cover page and references, had to be 600 words. You had to use 2 academic journal articles as references. I would pick special topics that for each student that tied to their internship. So I had students doing things in policing, students interning with courts, judges, and then students interning in community corrections and probations department. And so I chose hot topics across each of those 3 areas and assigned them to those students. And catered the workload to the amount of hours that they had left. There were also, you know, other ways to do this would be to create online discussions via LMS, which, you know, Canvas is ours at IU. So these discussions would be designed to get students to immerse and engage themselves in special topics and current events. A lot of, you know, and this is something I've carried over into the summer with the academic capstone course that I'll get into as well. But, you know, everything going on in criminal justice reform right now has really fallen into my lap as an educator and provides a great deal of potential conversation across a wide variety of topics. And so that's what I've been focused on since it's popped up. And there's obviously, you know, several more options out there. In terms of ethical considerations, we thought about, you know, the need for, at least when possible, for asynchronous delivery to protect students' time. You know, particularly those who may still be working, having their own families, having their own lives turned upside down, trying to focus on asynchronous delivery. That now some of that may be discipline specific, but it was something that I was able to incorporate into the adjustment. There was a need for a generous use of discretion in terms of accommodating student needs, right? This is an extenuating circumstance. And so using the discretion that we have and the position that we have to be able to accommodate their needs within reason and making adjustments to deadlines, helping out however we can, trying to set them up for success. That's really, by the way, sort of a cornerstone idea of internships in general. And so of course it should be reflected in our own work. And then in terms of student learning, you know, making sure that the redesign of these courses are done so to still meet the course outcomes, and that when possible, they're relevant to the student's placement, what they were doing. Obviously they had an interest in that because they sought out that for their internship experience, trying to mirror that as best as we can to keep that interest going, keep that spark going. In terms of looking forward, you know, now we're talking beyond spring semester, so into summer and beyond. We also examined this from both practical and ethical perspectives. So there was a need to work quickly with university administrators to create and offer academic capstone courses as an alternative to internship courses, particularly for majors that require internships. So of our own, for instance, criminal justice does require its majors to complete an internship. And so my department head, Kelly Brown, and I worked with Eric Bain, Salvo, and the administrators to create an alternative capstone course, focusing heavily on research, special topics, position papers, still being able to incorporate the academic components of the internship course into it in terms of doing resumes, cover letters, how to go about interviewing, just it's obviously looking very different when there's no face-to-face opportunities, but making sure that we're not slowing anyone up for graduating. We had 2 students in our department who were set to graduate this summer and still will, and it's only because of the hard work of our administration that's going to be able to happen without sort of seamlessly and without hiccup. For summer, if there wasn't enough time to get the capstone course through remonstrance, which there wasn't for us, we thought outside of the box, and our department head, Kelly Brown, said, let's offer it as a special topics course, because many campuses have a special topics call number that they can get things through. So, just, realizing all the resources you have and using your discretion to pursue them as well as you can. If there is time for remonstrance, so for fall and beyond, creating a new course with its own unique course number to be offered in lieu of internship courses when most providers are not accepting interns. And then communicating with internship providers to ensure that there are protective measures in place to prevent the spread of COVID-19 in their workplace when they do resume internship programs. In terms of ethical considerations, for students, consider offering both internship and academic capstone courses to maximize student opportunities. We're thinking for the future now again. So while the pandemic brought the need for alternatives to light, the reality is that there is the potential for internships to reinforce economic disparities, where some students can afford to do them while others can't, or overextend themselves if they do. And so offering both internship and capstone courses provides additional flexibility for students who may be working full-time and or have their own families of their own. Are there ways to leverage technology to make internships more accessible? There's options for remote and online internship opportunities. How can this happen? Well, you can communicate with your, and it may be very discipline specific, but there's the opportunity to communicate with supervisors and faculty via video conferencing and or other electronic communications, and then tasks, projects, and experiences that interns can complete from their home and or campus to complete their internship hours. Again, this may be discipline specific. It may not work for, all different disciplines out there, but there may be opportunities. And I know Sarah Heath actually had shared one with me where it is a viable option. So really just, keeping our eyes open and considering all options moving forward for the best interests of our students. And with that, I'm going to open it up for questions.
Well, and actually, unfortunately, we've gone a bit over time here and need to make sure that we have enough space for our other team. So unfortunately, we are not going to have time for questions here. There has been a robust conversation going on the chat, and so hopefully folks are able to continue conversing in chat. But at this point, I'm going to ask Eric if he can kindly bring up our next team, and Terry is going to be introducing our next team for us. So thank you so much to this team.
We do award scholarships to students, and they get paid for some of our internships. So
yeah, thank you, Dr. Heath, for addressing that. There was a lot of questions in the chat box regarding unpaid internships and finances as it relates. Thanks to that third panel. Really interesting to think about at this moment how we have to redesign our courses and the requirements that come along with particular degrees and those with internships. What are we going to do and how are we going to make this happen? And so now we're going to move on to the fourth provocation. And as Eric is inviting these panelists, the fourth provocation is titled, "The Higher Education Business Model Hurts Faculty and Students." And so I'm going to turn it over to Amy Salmedo Johnson and let her introduce her team and the provocation. And let me ask you all, please try to stay within the 10 minutes so we do have some time for Q&A. Amy, if you can unmute yourself.
I thought I was unmuted. I was trying to figure out how to screen share so that I can put up our thing. I could do it in another setting, but now, of course, that's not happening. Oh, here. Oh, there's a big green button. All right. So we'll do, man, everything. There's just too many things on my screen. How do I do slideshow? Oh. So is this coming up for other people now?
Yes, we can see your screen. Go for it.
Now you can see my screen. All right. So our presentation is titled "The Higher Education Business Model Hurts Faculty and Students." Although the three of us are now all at different universities, Julia's at Drake, as she'll tell you about. Brian's at Mount Mercy and I work here at IU Kokomo. We all met because we all were previously employed by another university that led to us feeling that we needed to go to a different university. And I'll just put it like that. More students are attending college. There's more to choose from, as was covered yesterday in the presentation. And having all these different places to attend means students have more choices and can think about, well, is the debt of this institution worth it? What is the gain for students and universities? You know, is it worth it? And parents are thinking about that as they're sending their kids off to school. Is it worth it for my child to be crippled with $40,000 of debt right out of college? So these are some questions that are going around just everywhere right now, not just at that institution, but many institutions, and people are having to cope with that. The institutional economic reality of many institutions is that some people require more money to keep employed, and that can limit who is chosen to be valued. So this institutional reality of the difference between professors or assistant professors versus a lecturer position, which was something I had not been aware of before, versus adjuncts. So there seems to be this shift in our higher education where we are more so reliant upon short-term or at-will employees being adjuncts or lecturers compared to the traditional model, you know, capitulated in pop culture videos and movies of it all being professors at institutions, where many people at this conference are aware it's not just professors of different ranks at institutions. Increasingly, operations and decision-making at not-for-profit institutions of higher education are instead being modeled after for-profit businesses, which is very contrary. Institutions of higher education are not for profit. And so using a model of a for-profit business leads to some issues. And that is something that we experienced directly, but would like to explore further perhaps. So this presentation really just has to do with our three stories and how we've been impacted, but ultimately we would like to take this project further and perhaps include other people's stories, because all of our stories come from the same institution. But we are very aware that we're not unique, that many people experience similar situations with their employment at different institutions, because this seems to be happening in a lot of places of higher learning. This focus on business models referring to students as customers, kind of way different than thinking of them as students. So my personal impact, in 2014, I graduated with my PhD and I had applied to 70 some odd jobs, and then I had multiple phone interviews, 2 in-person interviews. I got the call. I got a tenure track job. I was ecstatic. I was like, oh my God, these are so hard to land, and I got one. And it took me like less than a half hour to call back and say, yes, I'll accept this position, thinking this will be it. I'm set for the next 30 years because I'm in the tenure track line. My personal training and research background is in biopsychology, so neuroscience. I had my training involved many animal models looking at anxiety and depression. So I have always considered myself to be a scientist because biopsychology is a science. But many individuals at this institution didn't feel I was a scientist because my degree is psychology, which is technically a social science. So I was treated as, well, she can't be a scientist. She has a psychology degree. How could she know anything about science? That's not science, which I wholeheartedly disagree with. I had one colleague ask me at every faculty meeting for 4 years that I was at this institution, and I brought my coffee mug that has a rat on it from Kent Scientific, repeatedly asked me over the course of 4 years, you did animal research, Amy? And I said, yes, I did. I did animal research for my dissertation, my undergraduate, my master's. And then last spring I did it here on campus. Don't you remember? Look at the poster in the hallway. So that and other experiences at this institution that was struggling financially and pitting faculty against each other, having us fight for our value and why we should continue to be employed, led me to realize around fall 2017 that, which was my third year at that, or fourth year, fall of my fourth year, that I needed to get back on the job market. So I did. And luckily, I found a job at IU Kokomo, another tenure track job as an assistant professor. And though I was super excited and felt supported during my interview process, when I arrived on campus, I still had this mentality that people were questioning my worth, that people were out to get me, which couldn't be further from the truth. But due to space limitations, my office wasn't located in the suite with the other psychology faculty. So all during my first year, I had this random office in a whole different building, and then I had an office down by Bain Salvo in another room that I shared. And so I always kind of felt like, oh, do these people have the same value for me as my previous institution? They like act like they like me up front, but really feel I'm valueless. Are they doing this on purpose because they don't like me? So all these thoughts kind of characterized my first year, and I had to mentally work through that trauma because they weren't out to get me. It was simply a reality of the situation. It wasn't that anybody didn't want me there or didn't value me. But it took some time to get through that personally, to come to this conclusion that, yeah, my colleagues value me. Oh, wait, there's people in other areas. I'm doing projects with people in biology, chemistry, exercise science, etc. So that was part of my feelings and experience. Now I'm going to turn it over to Brian to share his experience. This is Brian Gatsky, who is an assistant professor at Mount. I totally forgot to introduce everybody.
Okay, I'll introduce Julia next.
Okay.
Anyway, so you can see kind of a little history here, but what I got out of the experience working at the institution from my second year to my last year, I spent a lot of time in administrative conversations and budget meetings, recruitment meetings, and the like, and I kept getting this picture of why are students referred to by their dollar sign. Why is it worth $10,000, and that includes what they are for tuition and room and board, which then came to fruition this spring when COVID hit and everybody hit a financial panic button. So institutions that were already on the fringe prior to this were pushed more so. But we've observed that places closing. A lot of us knowing that we have a very bad economic climate right now for higher education based on the perceptions of higher education, and that has to change in using this business model of having students referred to as customers or consumers, like education is a product we can produce more of and have it then be consumed by more people to give us more money and revenue and will keep our institution alive is not a successful model for higher education. We need to move away from that and actually remind ourselves why higher education is important, because there has to be value there for people to buy into, not just a product that's mass produced, which is what we're trying to do. And then next is Julia Franklin down at Drake.
Thanks, Brian and Amy. I want to echo that I got to meet Brian and Amy when I was co-facilitating a new faculty orientation development year-long session at our previous institution, where we worked to try and help people understand the process of acclimating to a new school. I think a lot of what happens with new faculty is very similar to first-year students or new students, transfer students, and kind of helping them understand how things work. I was really, at that time, I was division chair and then switched out of that role, but really goes back to 2008. We had previously had a president that was a Shakespeare scholar, and then we had a president who came from the business world, and things quickly changed and adapted. So the arts, we had to learn a whole new language. We had to talk the language of business. We had to talk about enrollment. We had to talk about productivity. We had to talk about efficiencies. But we also were trying to create these reports where we showed that we were worthy, that we showed that we were valued in alumni studies and all sorts of reports. But it didn't fit the agenda and the direction that the university wanted to go. So I don't know how many of you feel like you've spent so much time putting together information and data that actually goes unread or is unwelcomed because it doesn't fit the agenda or mission of the administration and not necessarily the history of the institution itself. I'm really concerned about how faculty are being pushed into adjunct roles. When I left my position, I left a tenured position last year to take a staff position at another institution. My job actually became taught by someone who was paid just adjunct pay. He taught full-time, my full-time load without service components for $24,000 and no benefits. And what the university lost when they made that decision is that they also lost someone who was on committees, who was serving the institution, who was advising students. And that in turn really hurts faculty retention. It reduces shared governments because there's no one there who has voice and vote to advocate for people. But it also kind of erodes trust and respect and quality at the university and what they provide both for students and for faculty. So Amy, I'll turn it back over to you. Oh, unmute yourself, Amy.
Man, I always feel like I'm like, how do you not remember to unmute yourself? And then I do the exact same thing. So those are just our personal stories, but we kind of, we recognize we all were at the same institution, but stuff like this is going around other places. So we would like to expand to include other people's stories. I mean, all three of us were hired to tenure track positions or were in tenure track positions. I think, Julia, you were a full professor at the point. Yeah, that's what I thought. That's needed the nod. And we didn't even in this presentation talk about, well, Julia began to talk about the impact on students, but it definitely impacts students. I kind of forgot my note. When I left somebody I'd been planning to do a senior project with, but I couldn't stick around for 1 year for her when it would really mean I was banking on the institution for 30 years, which I'm not quite sure that will turn out to be. That presentation we saw yesterday, I think the institution would be in the red category of likely closing from the impact of COVID. As Julia talked about, the health of the university with faculty, constant faculty change. If you're hiring adjuncts, they're not on the boards that influence policies because they're not expected to have that service component. But that's important. We all know that having our voices heard counts and influences where the university goes. So those are places we'd like to go. Still very early in this process, but hope to turn this into something more pronounced, because the impact of all of these business model policies, some has been explored about students, but how it impacts the health of a university and individual faculty is less explored. So it's something we think would be worthwhile, not just from our personal experiences, but for the higher academics as a field.
Thanks to each of you for sharing your personal stories as it relates to the business model restructuring that we've seen at many of our higher education institutions. I think there's a lot of amens in the chat box right now. I understand what you're saying. We have time for one quick question. I was hoping that maybe one of you, and this has to be really, really quick, but thinking about, from your perspective of this and these experiences that you've had, what's maybe one redesign for, to get us, I don't want to say get us back, you know, like I don't want to act like the past was glorious or something, but redesign to where we can get to a healthier place for faculty and students in our education model?
I would say the redesign would have to start from like outside the institution as a whole, but rather people, the value of higher education is being questioned, and whether or not, oh, well, can I just get this certification and then I'll make just as much money? So what's the difference? And I think that having a populace who only knows how to do one specific thing is very limiting. I say that all the time about myself, that I know a lot, but about this much of the world. So I still need to expose myself to new ideas. And
Yeah,
one of the ways to do that is liberal arts education.
Right, interesting take on that. Thank you. Amy, if you will stop your screen share at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Howard.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Terry. Thanks so much to this group for provoking us in this way. So we turn now to our final wicked provocation for the day. And this one is going to help us be thinking about where we go from here. We've had a bit of a movement from what's happened with the COVID pandemic to how we even rethink how our institutions are structured. And our final presentation of the day is entitled Higher Education and Democracy After Summer 2020. And so this group will hopefully be providing us with some directions of where we go. We're delighted to welcome as members of this group Elizabeth Benyon, Eric Bain Salvo, Paul Cook, Scott Lee, Margot Morgan, and Ellen Sarletta. So we'll turn it over to your team.
I guess I will start. Can you guys see me? Okay. So our panel is composed of faculty at the regional campuses of Indiana University. I'm Margot Morgan. I'm assistant professor of political science at IU Southeast. Also with us, we have Eric Bain Salvo, Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences at IU Kokomo, Paul Cook, associate professor of English from IU Kokomo, Elizabeth Benyon, professor of political science from IU South Bend, and E. Scott Lee, assistant professor of political science from IU East. And to introduce what we're going to talk about. So obviously the COVID-19 pandemic, combined with the eruption of the new civil rights movement, has pushed us to reimagine the university and its role in society. A healthy democracy requires us to reassume the responsibilities of civic education that were once at the heart of the university's mission as an institution. So we're asking how the university impart the skills, virtues, and experiences necessary for effective civic education. We will be presenting visions of the university, not as it is, but as it could be, in order to expand the conversation on the limits of the possible. And with that, I will turn it over to Elizabeth Benyon from IU South Bend.
Hey, thank you so much, Margot. And my provocation is how we can make the university more public. What if every public university thought of themselves and their faculty, staff, and students as engaged citizens and community members? What if each university understood their mission as fostering civic knowledge, skills, and engagement in the community at large in order to improve the lives of people in the region or in the world? What if the university saw its resources as public resources and did more to encourage the public to utilize these resources to promote civic learning, democratic engagement, and community development, instead of focusing on classroom-based practice activities designed to equip tuition-paying students with critical thinking and deliberation skills? What if faculty incorporated public events and open classrooms into all courses to allow students and non-students to deliberate and brainstorm together about the issues that matter most to the local community? What if campuses nationwide became the site of local, state, and national political debates? What if we volunteered to serve as polling places and to work with county elected election administrators to train students to work the polls? What if we developed civic leadership academies, working with political leaders and community activists to equip people with the combination of knowledge and skills they need to make a meaningful difference in their communities? What if campuses hosted free campaign colleges for local citizens from all demographic and partisan backgrounds? And what if campuses nationwide became central meeting places for civic organizations of all kinds, and working with these organizations became an expected part of what it means to be a faculty member or be part of the university community, with diverse and interdisciplinary groups of students, faculty, and staff joining others across the community to address the wicked problems that defy easy solutions and require all of us to harness our collective experience, energy, and wisdom. These could take place on campus, with the university members going out throughout the community and online. And these are just a few ideas for how to make our university campuses more public and to better fulfill the public purpose of higher education.
So I think I'm next. So I'm Eric Bain Salvo, and my provocation is fairly straightforward. It is based on the assumption that if we want to think about higher education as a place where we cultivate civic virtues, as Margot said, where we nurture citizen engagement, where we teach democracy, then our campuses have to be places of democratic practice, and not practice in an unmeaningful way, like we have, students vote on pizza of the week, but in deeply meaningful ways where people think they are involved in institutions and practices that make a difference, where meaningful decisions are made that will affect their lives and the lives of future cohorts of students or future faculty or future staff. So, and you'll hear what if a lot in our presentations. What if the administration of our institutions was radically different? I know that's just a terrible thing for an administrator to say. What if students could regularly see democratic practices among the various campus constituencies and even participate in various democratic practices? For example, instead of a staff council or a faculty senate that operate in isolation with relatively little institutional power, what if all the constituencies, including students, were part of one deliberative body and process? What if such a body was given the power to make decisions that traditionally have been the reserve of upper administration? What if students joined with faculty in determining curricula? At the course level, perhaps students could help determine topics or readings. At the broader curricular level, perhaps they could help determine what kind of courses should be scheduled. What if we map power relations and decision processes and sought to figure out how to democratize that power and those processes? With such maps, we could find many places where students could be legitimate partners in the decision-making process. What if we sought ways to give the broader citizenry more of a say in the direction of the institutions that are in their communities? Many of these are public institutions that are to serve their communities and regions. Shouldn't community representatives have some say in how these institutions operate and what these institutions can do for communities? Imagine how powerful the experience would be for students to work closely with community members in this regard. And finally, what if we abandoned traditional elections and took the democratic lottery approach instead, helping to increase participation and getting a richer diversity of voices into campus conversations? These are just a few ideas for democratizing campuses. Such campuses would become environments where students not only learn about democracy and civic virtues, but live democracy and practice civic virtues. As educators, we proclaim the democratic purposes of higher education. We then would be practicing what we preach. And I think Scott's next.
Thanks, Eric. Walk with me, if you would, into that mythical ideal classroom. We have students listening to each other, they're sharing, they're discussing their ideas with others in the class, they're practicing critical thinking. Well, now let's come back to reality. What do we usually have? I teach a lot of political science classes, and what I typically have are students that come in, a few of them who know what's right, and they're going to make sure that everybody knows that they're right, and that if they don't think the same way they do, then they're wrong. Just imagine how our students, our classrooms, our campuses, communities, and even the world might change if we could get our students to realize a few things. First, that the world does not revolve around them or what they think, that other people may think differently than they do, that those other people might be right, and that's okay. If they realize that if they don't listen to others, they're not going to learn. They have to learn to listen for understanding. All views have merit. Those views may be right, they may be wrong, but all need to be listened to. If our students could realize that earnestly listening to and considering possibilities and ideas doesn't necessarily Whoa. Okay, my time's up, and I couldn't get my button to stop. Okay, if we could get our students to learn to listen to each other, and that if they can understand that they have to be able to understand all sides of an argument well enough so they can explain them to someone else and make a convincing argument using valid and verifiable evidence to that particular side of the argument that's right. If they can't do that, then they're really not ready or have enough information to decide for themselves what's right or wrong. And sometimes there isn't a right or wrong answer. As educators, do we purposefully and continually come up with learning activities that will help them think about what they believe, write it down, share it vocally with others, defend what they say? Do we teach them critical thinking skills? We all talk about it, but do we actually teach them the steps to go through? And then do we give them the opportunity to practice? Final question is for us as educators ourselves. Do we as educators do those things for ourselves? And if not, how can we expect our students to do them? Thanks.
All right, I think I'm next. My provocation is about civic virtue. So top administrators for universities often publicly decry the allegation that their institution is one that indoctrinates its students by pushing political ideology on them. This is captured in the oft-repeated remark that the university doesn't teach you what to think, but how to think. But this belies the history of the university as part of the liberal public sphere, the space carved out for democratic debate, discussion, and civic participation. And the values on which our universities were built were those of classical liberalism. We need our universities to return to their original mission, to create active, informed, and responsive democratic citizens. So my question is, what if, instead of denying that higher education promotes specific ideological values, universities embrace their role as bastions of classical liberalism and liberal virtue? What if faculty let their students know that they are being indoctrinated? Maybe we could find a better word for it, but they are being encouraged to value pluralism, civic engagement, limited government, and love of democracy. Let's take things one step further. What if the university were to trumpet not only classical liberal values, but also those of classical republicanism, chiefly civic responsibility, and the belief that community matters just as much, if not more, than the needs of individuals? What if we could get our students to see that our collective interest is the same as our individual interest in the long run? So this is my provocation, to imagine a university that openly embraces civic virtue and its role in promoting it. And with that, I will pass the torch on to Paul.
Thanks, everybody. So let me try to do, let me do this as quickly as I can. Because we're short on time. So basically, as some of you may know, I'm kind of an amateur historian of the university as a modern social institution since the Enlightenment. And following up on what Margot said, I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted a few transitions, changes, issues within higher ed that were already there, that have been there for some time, but that have been really intensified in the last few months. And so I'm going to list those off real quick. So number one, in the post-pandemic classroom, teaching, whatever, higher ed, we can no longer take for granted or as a default the physical classroom as kind of the center of what we do. And this is going to prompt us, it already has, as we've seen, but it will continue to prompt us to ask really challenging and radically transformative questions about our pedagogy, about teaching, about learning, about schooling, about credentialing, about all those things we got into on Tuesday afternoon at the Radical Ideas discussion. Number two, the university, and already this was happening in the 1970s, as Jean-Francois Lyotard discusses in his condition of postmodernity, and others have argued since. that the university is no longer at the center of society's information flows and credentialing apparatuses, nor is it at the center of our kind of knowledge economy. Another way of saying this is that the university, or that learning, education, schooling, and knowledge is no longer the sole provenance or the product of the university. Whereas at one point it was, not so long ago, right? If you wanted to learn something, even practical, sort of basic, non-specialist information, you went to the university library. No longer the case. And then number three, in the reality that has been brought to us by number two, so in the sort of epistemological reality that has been made clear, by number two, we as faculty are no longer, assuming we ever were, we can no longer afford to see ourselves as, quote, masters of content. And this is going to be really hard for a lot of faculty to sort of get, or to wrap their minds around, or to, get on board with. But we are no longer the masters of content, okay? We must learn to think of ourselves as masters of resourcefulness. We have to model for our students how to think in the digital era. We have to model for them how to be, and how to be mindful, and how to be productive in the face of this, as Miller puts it, quote, this endless torrent of information. So basically, my provocation, I'm going to turn to a book that I read recently by James Bridle. This is a short little paragraph that I'm going to read. James Bridle, he's a technologist, futurist. He has a book called New Dark Age, Technology and the End of the Future. And this is the paragraph that I want to read to sort of end this. He says, quote, "If we do not understand how complex technologies function, how systems of technologies interconnect, and how systems of systems interact, then we are powerless within them, and their potential is more easily captured by selfish elites and inhuman corporations. Precisely because technologies interact with one another in unexpected and often strange ways, and because we are completely entangled with them, this understanding cannot be limited to the practicalities of how things work." So you see this with all these initiatives with STEM and with teaching students how to code, right? That stuff's important, nothing wrong with that, right? But that's the technocratic element of it, right? So to continue, Bridle says, quote, "It must be extended to how things came to be, how they continue to function in the world in ways that are often invisible and interwoven. What is required is not understanding, but literacy." And that's where we come in. If we want to maintain anything like the university space that we have had for the last 600 or 700 years, we have got to shift the way we think about ourselves, from thinking about ourselves as masters of content, just thinking about ourselves as almost more as really guides, right? As kind of guides who can show students how to deal with information saturation and information overload, and kind of just the confusion of living in a post-digital era, and to help them understand how the technologies that rule and structure our lives came to be, what their history is, and not just kind of leaving our understanding at the sort of how things work in a technocratic sense. Thank you.
Thanks to this panel so much. Give me just a minute and a half here to wrap up. Thank you all. I was thinking during the early part of the presentation how poetic the what ifs were, and how productive it might be if this team got together and compiled a list of what ifs for us to consider as provocations. And then how interesting it might be to actually do this what if experiment with our students and ask them, what do they think the provocations of higher education might be? Particularly, it just might be a good moment in our redesign in the fall to get their input on it. Thanks to each of you. This was such, to all of our panelists, from the first provocation to the end, such phenomenal provocations. And really at this moment, I think it gives us so much to feed on. I want to thank Bain Salvo for being the puppet master in the background, pulling all the strings and making all this happen. Thanks to my co-curator, Dr. Melanie Howard.